Today, we're diving into the shocking downfall of one of Australia's most notorious bikie bosses, Karl Labrook. He was once the leader of the Rebels Motorcycle Club, but now he's facing criminal charges, leadership disputes, and even a major shift in allegiances. So, what went wrong for Labrook? How did the man at the top of the Rebels fall from grace so quickly? From huge amounts of cash stuffed into Christmas presents to a mass exodus of club members, his story has more twists than a Hollywood thriller. Karl Labrook wasn't always in the headlines for the wrong reasons. Back in the day, he was just another guy looking to make his mark in the world of outlaw motorcycle gangs. But things quickly escalated, and before long, he found himself at the top of one of the most feared gangs in Australia, the Rebels Motorcycle Club. Labrook's story starts like so many in the biker world. He was drawn to the club's tight-knit brotherhood, and of course, its rebellious lifestyle. But what set him apart wasn't just his love for bikes and tattoos. It was his drive and ability to rise through the ranks. With the Rebels, he didn't just blend in, he stood out. It didn't take long for Labrook to become a key player in the club's Western Australia chapter. By all accounts, he was good at what he did. Whether it was managing the club's operations, handling tensions with rival gangs, or navigating the legal maze that comes with being part of an outlaw club, Labrook had the skills, and the members of the Rebels Motorcycle Club respected him for it. He wasn't just another face in the crowd. He built relationships, earned trust, and most importantly, became the man who could get things done when they needed to be done. Over time, his reputation grew, and so did his power. When he finally became the president of the Rebels WA chapter, Labrook was on top of the world. At this point, Labrook's life seemed like the dream, a leader of one of Australia's most notorious motorcycle clubs, with power, respect, and a community of loyal members. But as we know, when you're on top, the only way is down. But before all the trouble started, let's take a moment to understand what it was about Labrook that made him so influential. After all, his success in the Rebels wasn't some lucky break. He had a natural ability to command attention. He wasn't just another guy with a leather vest and a patch on his back. He had the mindset, the kind of mindset that makes people follow you, even when things get tough. Labrook didn't just lead by force, he led by example. Whether it was through his personal connection with members or his ruthless efficiency in handling business, people respected him. He wasn't afraid to make tough decisions, and that's what made him a leader in the eyes of the Rebels. But as with any story about a man who climbs to the top, things are never as perfect as they seem. Behind the scenes, cracks were starting to form. There were whispers of internal disputes, a growing sense of unease, and problems that Labrook wasn't prepared for. These problems would eventually shake the very foundation of the Rebels Motorcycle Club, and they all started from within. So, as the pieces of Labrook's reign began to fall apart, it wasn't long before the real story of his downfall would unfold. But that's a story for later. For now, just know this: Karl Labrook wasn't always the man you'd expect to see facing down a court judge, caught up in criminal charges, and walking away from the very gang he built himself up in. No, when he started out, Labrook was the kind of guy you'd bet on to succeed. But like all good things in the biker world, success doesn't always last. Sometimes it takes just one mistake, one moment of weakness, and the whole empire can crumble. And Labrook? He wasn't ready for the storm that was about to hit. But that, as they say, is just the beginning. It didn't take long for Karl Labrook's seemingly smooth ride to start hitting some serious bumps. The downfall didn't come from a rival gang, a police bust, or even an enemy within his own ranks. No, it came from something that would take even the toughest bikie bosses by surprise. What happened next would throw Labrook and the entire Rebels Motorcycle Club into the kind of spotlight they'd never wanted: the discovery of a massive amount of illegal cash. In December 2022, the Australian police made a discovery that would set the stage for everything that followed. They raided Labrook's vehicle and found over $450,000 in cash. And not just any cash, this was stashed away in an unusual way. Some of the money was wrapped up as Christmas presents. Can you imagine? The story sounds like something out of a crime drama, doesn't it? And yet, here it was, happening in real life. This wasn't some small-time operation. The money found in Labrook's car was just the tip of the iceberg. The The real bombshell came when investigators traced an additional $250,000 to a property owned by Kelly Kersley, a woman who was tied to the Western Australia horse racing scene and the daughter of Fred Kersley, a well-known trainer. She wasn't just some random associate. Kelly had ties that ran deep in the local elite circles. Now, you've got to wonder, how does a bicky boss end up with that kind of money? Was it all from legitimate sources, or was something more sinister at play? Labrook wasn't exactly hiding the cash in his pockets. It was out there, plain as day. And while Labrook was adamant that the money was legitimate, claiming it came from club dues and fundraising efforts, the truth of it all felt a little murky. Police weren't buying it. This wasn't just a few $100 tucked away for a rainy day. This was serious money, and it was tied to a man with enough influence and connections to make things disappear if he wanted to. And when you add in Labrook's status as the head of a notorious gang, you've got all the ingredients for a scandal that could bring the whole operation crashing down. As the investigation ramped up, the pressure on Labrook grew. He had a lot of explaining to do, and there were a lot of people watching. His reputation had been built on trust and strength within the rebels, but now it was all up for debate. Was he still the man who could lead them? Or had he become something else entirely? A leader who was too close to the illegal side of things, too wrapped up in the power and the money. The scandal was more than just about the cash, though. It symbolized a deeper issue within the Rebels Motorcycle Club. This wasn't just about money being found in an unexpected place. It was about the trust that had started to break down. The Rebels weren't just some group of guys riding around and having a good time. They were involved in more than anyone cared to admit. Money, power, and influence were the things that kept them going. And when the cash scandal hit, it revealed how fragile that balance really was. But this wasn't the end of Labrook's troubles. Oh no, far from it. The cash was just the start. There was still more brewing underneath the surface, things Labrook hadn't anticipated. As his legal woes grew, so did the cracks in his leadership. The scandal didn't just tarnish his reputation. It would begin to unravel the very fabric of the Rebels Motorcycle Club itself. What came next was a series of events that would change the course of Labrook's life forever. But before we get there, let's pause for a moment. Think about it. A man who had everything: respect, power, a position at the top of a feared gang, and it all came crashing down over money wrapped in Christmas paper. What does that tell us about Labrook's position, his leadership, and where things were headed? After the bombshell discovery of the cash, the fallout for Karl Labrook and the Rebels Motorcycle Club was swift and unforgiving. The once solid foundation of Labrook's leadership began to crack, and what followed wasn't just a legal battle, it was an all-out crisis within the Rebels that would change everything. You see, when you're at the top of a motorcycle gang like the Rebels, you can't just brush off a scandal like this. It wasn't like you could simply write a check, apologize, and move on. Labrook's involvement in this cash mess had shaken the very core of his position. The gang's operations were built on a foundation of respect, loyalty, and a certain level of fear. And now that foundation was wobbling. The whispers started circulating quickly. Some members of the Rebels started questioning whether Labrook had been completely upfront with them. The money wasn't just a little slip-up. It was big, and it wasn't wrapped in a way that made anyone feel comfortable. The more people talked, the more doubts crept in. But the situation only got worse. Remember, Labrook wasn't just some member in the middle of the pack. He was the leader of the Rebels Western Australia chapter. His decisions were supposed to guide the club forward. But now, with the scandal hanging over his head, the very people who looked up to him started to wonder if he was the man they thought he was. And it wasn't just the club members who were noticing. Police and law enforcement were also starting to turn up the heat. What had seemed like a minor incident, a bit of illegal cash here, a few connections there, quickly escalated into a full-scale investigation. The spotlight was squarely on Labrook, and he was under pressure from all sides. The first sign that things were spiraling out of control came when a few of Labrook's closest allies began to question his leadership. Tensions were rising, and some were beginning to lose faith in the man who had once led them so confidently. You could feel the uncertainty in the air, and it wasn't long before things went from bad to worse. It wasn't just about the cash anymore, it was about trust. And once that trust was broken, it didn't matter how long Labrook had been with the Rebels. Things were starting to fracture. So, what do you do when your foundation starts to crumble? For Labrook, the answer was complicated. His next move would be crucial, and little did he know, the choices he made in the coming months would set the stage for the ultimate collapse of his empire. Then came the moment no one saw coming. The national president of the rebels, Damian Vella, stepped in and began questioning Labrook's ability to lead. Vella wasn't about to let Labrook's issues drag down the entire gang. The leadership dispute between the two men began to intensify, and cracks that were already forming started to widen. Labrook, once the undisputed boss of the rebels, was now in a position where even his closest supporters were starting to hesitate. It's not hard to see why. When you're caught up in a scandal of this magnitude, you're not just fighting for your reputation. You're fighting for your place in the gang, your control over the group, and your power. Labrook was being challenged from within, and it wasn't a fight he could easily win. The situation escalated quickly. In the weeks following the discovery of the cache, more and more members began to question Labrook's leadership. A sense of unease spread like wildfire through the rebels. The cracks weren't just visible to outsiders, they were becoming impossible to ignore inside the club. And when a few key figures started defecting, it was clear that things were coming to a head. In a matter of weeks, the Rebels Motorcycle Club was in disarray. Labrook, who had once been the proud president, found himself facing the loss of everything he had worked for. He was losing allies, respect, and his hold on the club. The Rebels West Coast chapter was starting to splinter, and that meant more than just a few disgruntled members. It meant a power shift. The tipping point came when a wave of resignations hit. Labrook, in an unexpected move, announced that he was stepping down as the leader of the rebels in May 2024, after more than 2 decades of service. He wasn't alone in this decision. In the wake of his resignation, over 30 members of the Rebels Motorcycle Club followed suit, turning their backs on the gang they had called home for years. The exodus was massive, and it shook the very foundation of the rebels. But this wasn't the end of the road for Labrook. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, one that would see him leave the rebels behind, but not the world of outlaw motorcycle clubs. As Labrook stepped down, it was clear that the reputation he'd built over the years was crumbling faster than anyone could have predicted. He may have thought he could weather the storm, but it was clear now. The rebels were done with him. And as we'll see, that wasn't the only club Labrook would find himself involved with in the months to come. By May 2024, Karl Labrook's resignation from the rebels had sent shockwaves through the Australian biker world. But what followed next was nothing short of jaw-dropping. It wasn't just the fact that Labrook was leaving one of the most notorious biker gangs in Australia behind. It was what came next that made the entire situation even more complicated. With the rebels in turmoil and his leadership now a thing of the past, Labrook needed to figure out his next move. There was no going back to the life he once had, and it was clear that his time with the rebels was over. Labrook wasn't just looking for a way to keep his connections or protect his future. No, he was after something bigger. The Comanchero had the strength, the numbers, and the resources that Labrook needed. And in a world where power and influence were everything, switching allegiances to the Comanchero seemed like the perfect move for a man who had just watched his own empire collapse. It wasn't subtle either. The move was bold, and Labrook made it clear for everyone to see. During a court appearance in June 2024, Labrook made a public statement that would have far-reaching implications for the Australian biker scene. As he stood before the judge, something that could easily have gone unnoticed turned into a spectacle. Labrook was wearing the black and gold of the Comanchero Motorcycle Club. That's right. The man who had been the proud leader of the rebels just a few months earlier was now publicly showing his allegiance to their rivals. It was a move that sent shockwaves not only through the biker community, but also through law enforcement agencies and anyone keeping an eye on the underworld. In a world where loyalty and loyalty alone meant everything, this wasn't just a change in clubs. It was a declaration of war. Now, you might be thinking, wasn't this the kind of thing that could get Labrook in serious trouble? Absolutely. Switching from one major gang to another wasn't just a personal decision. It was one that came with serious consequences. Rivalries between these clubs ran deep, and the move could easily spark conflict between the two gangs. Labrook wasn't just a random member either. He was a high-profile figure who had been at the top of the rebels for years. If the Comanchero didn't handle this right, they could end up with a target on their backs. But Labrook wasn't backing down. He wasn't intimidated by the possibility of retaliation. For him, this was about survival. The Comanchero, in his eyes, offered what the rebels no longer could: a fresh start, a new chapter, and a place where he could rebuild his power. Whether or not that was a smart move, only time would tell. As for the rebels, well, they weren't going to let this slide. The mass resignation that followed Labrook's departure from the club was only the beginning. With Labrook's defection to the Comanchero, it felt like the final nail in the coffin of his relationship with the rebels. Some of the club members who hadn't already jumped ship were likely looking at Labrook's move and wondering where they stood. Was he just another turncoat, or had he really found a better home in the Comanchero? But one thing was clear: this move was going to stir the pot. A man who had been the face of one of Australia's biggest and most feared gangs was now part of their biggest rival. The entire biker scene was watching, waiting for the next phase of this saga to unfold. Would Labrook manage to fit into his new role with the Comanchero, or would the storm of conflict and rivalry catch up with him? One thing was certain: Labrook was about to find out just how deep the rivalries between these outlaw motorcycle clubs really went. And in a world like this, where blood and loyalty ran thicker than anything else, switching sides wasn't just a personal choice. It was a gamble that could either pay off or blow up in his face. But Labrook wasn't done yet. No, this was just the beginning of a new chapter for him. And this one would see even more twists and turns ahead. What happens when you go from being on top of the world to being at the center of a full-blown gang war? Well, stay tuned, because this is where things really start to heat up. When Karl Labrook made the audacious decision to join the Comanchero Motorcycle Club, he wasn't just signing up for a fresh start. He was igniting a firestorm in the biker world. It wasn't simply about a single man leaving one club for another. It was about a shift in the balance of power, and it sent ripples through the entire motorcycle gang community in Australia. Labrook's defection wasn't the end of the story for the rebels, not by a long shot. In fact, it was only the beginning of a mass exodus that shook the club to its core. As the former leader of the Western Australia chapter, Labrook had been a linchpin in the club's operations. His influence was undeniable, and his departure left a void that was impossible to ignore. Soon after his resignation, over 30 rebels members followed in his footsteps and left the club to join him in the Comanchero ranks. The exodus was nothing short of a revolution within the rebels, and it was happening right under their noses. For the rebels, this wasn't just a matter of losing a few members. It was an all-out breakdown of the club's structure. With Labrook's former allies jumping ship, the remaining members were left to pick up the pieces. And for many, that meant finding new allegiances, fast. But why did so many follow Labrook? After all, this wasn't just a decision to switch clubs. This was a statement. The rebels had been fractured by scandal, internal disputes, and a leadership vacuum. The club was no longer the powerful force it once was. For Labrook, the move to the Comanchero was a chance to rebuild, but for the members who followed, it was more than that. They were chasing something bigger, a sense of purpose, security, and strength that they felt was missing in the rebels. The Comanchero, on the other hand, were more than happy to welcome the new recruits with open arms. The mass defection was a clear message. The Comanchero weren't just about survival, they were about expansion. They saw an opportunity to strengthen their position in Australia, and they were willing to bring in experienced, loyal members like Labrook and his followers to make it happen. The shift wasn't just internal within the clubs, it had broader implications for the entire outlaw motorcycle scene. What did it mean for the other gangs that were watching from the sidelines? The Comanchero were now stronger than ever, with Labrook and a host of skilled bickies joining their ranks. For rival gangs, this was a wake-up call. With the rebels in disarray and the Comanchero rising to power, there was no telling how this would affect the fragile alliances between these gangs. The aftermath was swift. Police began to take notice of the growing tensions. Law enforcement agencies, already familiar with the world of outlaw clubs, were now dealing with the fallout from an even bigger problem. The Comanchero were no longer just a feared rival. They were a much stronger force with the addition of experienced rebels members. This shift made the stakes higher for everyone involved, including Labrook, who now found himself at the center of an even larger web of criminal activity. As for Labrook, the question became, would he manage to take on a leadership role in the Comanchero, or would his presence spark even more conflict with the already established power structure? He wasn't just a random recruit, he was a former president of the rebels, a man with a long history and an even longer list of connections. While he was looking for a new beginning, not everyone in the Comanchero would see it that way. Labrook's reputation preceded him, and in a world where power struggles were a daily reality, his new status as a defector from one of the biggest gangs in the country was bound to raise eyebrows. Things were heating up, and no one, including Labrook, could predict where the tension would lead. The exodus from the rebels was only a small part of the larger picture. What followed would be a battle for control, power, and influence between the top clubs in the country, with Labrook caught right in the middle of it all. As the dust began to settle on the shattered Rebels Motorcycle Club, the power dynamics in the Australian outlaw biker world had shifted. The Comanchero were on the rise, with Labrook and his group of followers leading the charge. But with rivalries running deep, alliances on shaky ground, and law enforcement hot on their heels, the coming months would determine whether this new chapter for Labrook would be one of triumph, or yet another downfall. By now, Karl Labrook's journey had gone from being the top dog of the Rebels Motorcycle Club to a figure caught in the middle of a bitter rivalry between the Comanchero and his former gang. The dust had settled, but it wasn't as simple as wiping the slate clean. Labrook's defection had sparked a chain of events that would lead to an even more uncertain future, both for him and for the biker world around him. Despite being welcomed into the Comanchero fold, Labrook wasn't necessarily guaranteed success. Sure, he brought with him years of experience and a loyal following, but in the world of outlaw bikers, respect isn't just handed out. It's earned, often the hard way. For Labrook, this was a whole new chapter. His reputation was still tainted by the cash scandal, and the legal battles were far from over. While the Comanchero might have given him a second chance, there were still unresolved issues that could come back to bite him. On top of that, there was the ever-looming threat from rival gangs. The exodus from the rebels had left deep scars, and the Comanchero now stood as a bigger target for other clubs who weren't too thrilled about their new power. The whole situation was a powder keg waiting to explode. No one in the outlaw motorcycle world expected Labrook's shift to be the end of the drama. Meanwhile, police were watching closely. The cash scandal had already put Labrook and his associates under intense scrutiny, and law enforcement would only ramp up their efforts to track down the networks and operations behind these gangs. With Labrook's name now tied to the Comanchero, every move he made would be under the microscope. His association with the club, combined with his criminal history, meant that the authorities weren't going to back off anytime soon. But despite the chaos, one thing was undeniable. Labrook's survival instincts were sharp. He had navigated years of gang wars, power struggles, and the ever-present threat of law enforcement. There was no denying that he was good at what he did, even if his methods were questionable. It wasn't so much about if he could survive, but how much he was willing to sacrifice in order to stay on top. In the end, Labrook's future was as uncertain as ever. Would he rise to the top of the Comanchero and rebuild his empire? The biker world isn't known for second chances, and Labrook had already used up more than his fair share. As we wrap up the story of Karl Labrook, we're left with a sense of inevitability. His journey has been a roller coaster ride, and while it might seem like he's reached a stable point in the Comanchero, we know better. In this world, the twists aren't over. The rivalries, the power struggles, and the constant pull between loyalty and survival mean that Labrook's fate is still very much in the air. Will he become a leader in the Comanchero and find redemption, or will the ghosts of his past drag him down into a new kind of chaos? As of now, there are no clear answers. But one thing's for sure, Karl Labrook's story is far from finished, and whatever happens next, it's bound to be just as shocking as everything that came before it. The world of outlaw motorcycle clubs is unpredictable, and for someone like Labrook, it's a game of power, trust, and constant danger.